Welcome to On the Road with Al and Ivy. My name is Al Handler, presenting literary essays, classic book talk, and humor from my works on Vella, Kindle Unlimited, and my blog on X.
I'm going to discuss Gone to Texas and Josey Wales by author Forrest Carter and Knowing What's Important and Moral Courage. Josey Wales is a 1976 film starring Clint Eastwood in the starring role, which was well received both at the box office and by critics. It was based on Forrest Carter's Western novel Gone to Texas, with the main character Josey Wales based on a true-life bushwhacker from the Ozark Mountain region. The movie was pretty true to the book and did an excellent job of depicting the post-Civil War period in Missouri and out west. The book was published in 1973 and as a result had a more sympathetic view of the Native American characters than in earlier eras. The 1976 sequel, The Vengeance Trail of Josey Wales, is notable for portraying a young Geronimo. What's interesting about the book is that the underlying code of honor was similar to earlier systems like chivalry. In this case, the gunslinger who always let the other guy draw his gun first and so on. There was something to that notion of a code in the Wild West. All myths do spring from some kernel of truth, but in most cases are created to illuminate a perfection that rarely exists. The noble knights indeed showed respect to peers and superiors and at least paid lip service to protecting the weak. But in medieval times, the safety of peasants depended more on their economic value as serfs and the fact that there was little honor in killing one. The advent of the anti-hero in the 1960s was essentially a demystification of the noble archetype, and the early criticism of movies and books that had morally ambiguous heroes was in retrospect based on defending the values that the earlier paragons represented. We're not necessarily talking about virtue. Hero myths generally reinforce a social order. The noble knights were considered better than the average person, and chivalry was theoretically about the responsible use of power. Even in modern times, the idea that a true gentleman protected women was as much about respecting another man's property as it was about regarding them as human beings. That is, if the man cared to do so. Enforcement was generally on the honor system. The title of hero in medieval times came with entitlements, like being free to lord it all over others below him and commit assault and plunder in wartime, which were, thanks to paid bards and other toadies, glossed over with poetic phrases about gentle champions and incredible feats. The 60s anti-hero was a sort of democratization of the classic hero image, which gave a commoner the same mythic values and of course the same prerogatives like sinful sex without having the church damning him to hell, being able to kick butt on non-apex males, and all the other fun stuff that a medieval duke could indulge in. That not only riled up society's betters, but also those followers who were playing by the rules and resented some guy cutting in line. Such non-mythical exceptions are illuminating, but frankly not always relevant. We do enjoy fables and mythology and like the validation of principles and ethos that show a path to the higher things. The exception to modern chivalry is the internet, which is still a law of the jungle type trip and about 80% porn. That figure's off the top of my head, but it seems about right. And it's an exception to the normal evolution of society. What people admire about the Josey Wales character is that his decisions had no material reward in mind and often put him in greater danger. Still, his sense of honor dictated that he protect those in his care and couldn't do otherwise unless he was willing to betray his sense of self. A good real-life example of moral courage would be someone who chose a hard road to freedom that many wouldn't take and paid a very high price for it. One of the characters in my Vella book, On the Road with Al and Ivy, the summer of 2016, is a woman who could only escape physical and emotional abuse by going homeless. That was a common situation for many homeless women in Silicon Valley in 2016. Most women, especially the younger ones, didn't have the resources or earning power to get an apartment that generally took a few thousand up front to get in, and that's if the place was available. I saw a lot of young women sleeping in parking lots, rest stops, and other places during that time. There was a turning point where she, the character, realized that staying in an abusive environment would destroy her, which was when her husband knocked her to the floor for speaking out of turn. Her only friends were other women who in their culture had to independently help without their husband's support, and the only males who offered to help wanted sex in exchange for it. The ex did his best to punish her. He hired a lawyer to block custody and even contact with their child. He didn't pay any support, which forced her to live in an old van with a schizophrenic son from an earlier marriage, and 2 family dogs that the ex didn't want anymore. The van was later towed away by police, and they were forced to live in a smaller car that she could barely pay for. She was on waiting lists for services, but other than an offer to commit her son, nothing had come through. Her decision to leave was regarded as abandonment in the divorce court, and the side with the lawyer won. Yet, she never regretted leaving. She didn't view the situation as punishment, and clearly understood that her old state of mind was a trap. Living in a car, at least temporarily, was the price of freedom here, but she didn't give in to it. She kept applying for jobs and found a part-time situation and held it. She also did other odd jobs like dog sitting for other homeless, like me for example, for what we could afford to pay. She once saved my dog from a couple that attempted to steal her while I was at work. She put Ivy in her car and drove off while a so-called respectable couple threatened to call the cops. That happened a lot out there, people bullying the homeless and trying to intimidate them through their pets. What she did was no small deed. A police call on a homeless woman of color could be devastating, possibly resulting in the loss of a car that could remove the one protection a single woman had in that scene. But she was responsible for Ivy that night and protected her as her own. Living in a car was a hard road out of a destructive situation. The price was high, and she had to deal with the trauma of years of abuse while coping with a tough life. She did everything right, keeping herself clean, avoiding drugs and alcohol, working as much as she could, constantly communicating with agencies that could help, going to church, and resisting the temptation to trade sex for rescue. In her mind, it was all part of being ready for when a break came. There was an easier road. All she had to do was turn her son over to authorities to be committed, abandon her 2 dogs, and, given her youth and good looks, find a guy willing to give her an easier life. She couldn't do that, being determined to bring their family out together, like the character Josey Wales does with his group in the book. We admire such courage because it is exceptional and validates our better side. Certain other elements of the story came to life there, that in a dangerous atmosphere, people revert to social protocols like described in the Josey Wales book, and that if you had a running car, it was as precious as any outlaw's horse. Those protocols, or street manners for lack of a better word, have been described in earlier blog entries like observing someone for a while before approaching. Many of my actual contacts tended to follow a definite sequence, which I won't claim is true for all street scenes. These protocols didn't have names, it was just the way things were done in that particular area. There were good reasons to be cautious. You never knew who was approaching and what their motive was. Most of the contacts were routine, but when something terrible happened, it tended to be sudden or when the person was caught off guard, in many cases when you were asleep. As a result, I never acted approachable, which wasn't the same as acting tough or hostile, and I was always vigilant. Besides, there was no hurry to make friends or do anything rash out there. In essence, cautious protocols created a barrier of time and distance to prevent surprise. When somebody approached, I rarely made eye contact. That could be misinterpreted as a challenge if the person coming was belligerent. I always acted a little slow, almost stupid, which was contrary to what you see with streetwise characters in movies. But most people aren't aggressive with the slow or mentally ill. I never did anything sudden either, as that could trigger a defensive reaction. This all happened in a few seconds, and the other parties generally understood I was just being careful. Once the conversation started, it stayed casual, though some personal details might be exchanged, like how long you've been homeless, where, and etc. If somebody asked what I had in the car trunk, as the other stuff could be seen without getting fancy about it, or if I had drugs, I'd always humorously say no and plead poverty. Asking overly personal questions about possessions always signaled an end to the conversation. I generally say, nice talking to you, and say that I had to head back up to the rest stop up north, and as a precaution I headed south instead. I had valuables in the car, most of all Ivy, so there was no point in sticking around after possibly being cased. One time I did stick around, and later on, someone tried to break into the car while we were off hiking. I made a big deal of having a running car in my earliest blogs. I'd see people who didn't prioritize gas and just shake my head. One couple would panhandle cash, buy a nice dinner and beer, party it up, and the next day be trying to raise gas money again. One day they couldn't raise it fast enough to escape being towed. Once a car was towed, that was it. Unless you had money for the towing and storage, the car and everything in it were gone. The Josey Wales character makes it a point to ensure that his horse always has oats to eat, not just grass. In a desperate situation, the horse is stronger with better nutrition, and the extra endurance could be enough of an edge to escape a tight situation. My car once broke down, and I was stranded for 6 weeks. The police knew how important a vehicle was, and in most areas wouldn't mess with your car because once it was towed, the person's only shelter and possession would be gone, along with what little chance there was of getting a job as a homeless person. So if you couldn't leave when asked, they'd cite you and eventually have to tow. Once I could get the car running again with the help of the internet and a kindly car mechanic, keeping it that way, no matter what, became a top priority. In my blog entries during that time, I referred to it as movement is survival, as there is nothing more important than making sure the car was running. There were days when Ivy and I had to split a cheap sandwich, but gas came first. For example, when the summer days hit 90 degrees, we could move to shade or head south to the coast where it was cooler. Last year, when I read about a homeless guy dying in Gilroy during a heat wave, I recognized the area. It had very little shade and it was always very hot because of the concrete. The highway in the news story had lots of businesses, so it was ideal for a panhandler who had to get around on foot, but no one could live there in the open during the summer. The car gave me an option that he didn't have. I did meet people and some became good friends. It wasn't all about caution. Without them, things could have gone very badly. That's another element of the Josey Wales story that resonated. Friendships do mean a lot. I recall one incident where my old iPhone fell out of my pocket and it was lost. You won't always get it back in regular society, as Apple products are eminently saleable on the black market. But a homeless couple found it and returned it. The guy said an interesting thing, that they would have just sold it for cash, but the screensaver was a photo of Ivy, and they remembered the Asian guy with the little white dog. The guy added that once the iPhone had a clear owner, returning it was the honorable thing to do. The couple were outlaws, in a sense, and had to leave town rather suddenly when the sheriff's deputies came looking for them. To this day I have no idea why, but my impression of them was positive. The guy made it clear that they could be trusted, and later on, the couple watched Ivy while I attended a week-long employee orientation class. Both were expert panhandlers and had to be. Both applied for jobs all over in the area, but their criminal records made it a futile search. Much of the detailed info in the book about street begging comes from what they told me. I remember one conversation. We were talking about the trouble in the Middle East. Yes, people had intelligent conversations out there. And he smiled and, like in the Josey Wales book, made sure there was a no offense stranger preface as he said, "I don't mean any offense, but why are you here?" I didn't know what he meant and asked why, and he replied, "You're obviously smart. You should be working at some computer place." I laughed at that remark, as people don't often know that working at a high-tech company usually doesn't require any more intelligence than other places. And I just replied, "If I were as smart as you think, I wouldn't be here." The entire conversation is in my book, with more detail. But what struck me at the time was that his manners were right out of a Western novel. Part courtesy, part caution. There was no law out there, at least in the sense that we usually expect. We see movies and TV shows where somebody threatens to call the cops, making the other back off or reconsider their actions. That can work sometimes. I'm not saying it ever does, but there are people out there that simply aren't afraid of the law. Crooks know that most of the homeless won't call the cops, and that all they have to do to prevent you from calling 911 is to take the phone away. Even if a call gets through, there's still the time it takes for the police to arrive, and when they do, they're likely to treat everybody as suspects, assuming the thief or attacker sticks around. They won't necessarily come as rescuers for one of the parties. Looking at it from their point of view, they aren't told that a bad guy is making trouble with a good guy, but that there's a disturbance or possible theft, and the situation needs to be sorted out. In other words, the law is just a veil of social training that hopes to keep criminal behavior in check, and most of the consequences are after the fact. One time, an ex-homeless man told me that he was stabbed with a knife while trying to defend his girlfriend from harassment. And though the attacker was caught, well, he still got stabbed. Getting justice is a different thing than being protected by the law. There was plenty of law after that incident, but there was none of that at the moment, which was more than enough time for the guy to get pinked. If other homeless hadn't intervened, he could have been killed, and the law would have made no difference to that guy's fate. Bob Dylan once sang, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." Even if the normal social norms aren't present, people tend to adopt behaviors and procedures based on caution and respect. That respect may be based on fear, but most law systems are the same. Caution isn't just a homeless thing. Women must use it when walking alone at night. Tourists are constantly reminded not to leave their belongings unattended in an airport, and that house and car doors shouldn't be left unlocked, and so on. It's just common sense to be careful. In a homeless area, you're generally in close contact with strangers, and like in the suburbs or a condo complex, You may never get to know your neighbors or even get along with them. The difference is, out there are no walls, fences, or other laws to keep each other apart. In such groups of strangers, it's tempting to think that such scenarios become like a Lord of the Flies situation, but that's not a given. In my book, there's a situation where it got like that, but as a rule, it was very much like the Old West, at least how it was described in books or depicted in movies. There were towns full of strangers and thus protocols. One pivotal scene in the Josey Wales book and the movie is when Wales meets the Comanche chief Ten Bears, and they agree not to fight, and the chief says that words must come from men and not governments or pieces of paper. It was about words with iron and honor among men. That's the mythology of the Wild West. In the real world, I found people of honor and swine, but the most significant lesson that Josey Wales taught me was always to take care of your horse. In other words, realize what's important and protect it. That's not mythology, but common sense.
You've been listening to On the Road with Al and Ivy, a collection of literary essays, classic book talk, and humor from the works of Al Handa on Bella, X, and Kindle Unlimited. This close with some music by Handa-McGraw. Thank you for listening.